And also, just something as well, if you want to, you can start planning in the other elements out, like what things are going to be. So in this example, what I basically just did was did yet another layer here in Photoshop that I could go and just use a brush tool or whatever and draw on and say, okay, well, what are these things going to be? Like, this is a title here. I might hide some of this stuff so I can see it a little bit better, but it's like, all right, that is going to be an H2 element, and so forth. This is going to be a paragraph. That's a paragraph. This is another H2. That's a paragraph, and so forth. You know, this is like, all right, well, that's also all these titles are H2, or maybe one of them you would decided was, you know, H3. That these are H3 here. I can just erase that, I guess, and so forth. Okay, so this is also important later on. You don't have to do it right now, but eventually you're going to have to make decisions about all this stuff, and so sometimes just looking at it here on the page can be a good place to do it. Alright, and so let's move on to the next one. So what you're going to do is you're going to start outside and work in as you're creating these sections. And following the next rule is that you use divs for the major area. So we're going to kind of do two at a time. We're going to start outside and work in and use divs for the major areas. So in a Photoshop file, let's start with these big boxes here. And we're going to do the header, navigation, side nav, content, sidebar, footer. And one thing to pay attention to is if one element is inside another. Like in this case, header contains the navigation. So basically what we'll do for each one of these is just make a div. And then we're going to say, give it a name. So ID equals header. And that is my header div from there. Now this contains navigation, so we're going to put another div, ID equals nav for that one. And we're not even putting content in at this point. We're just blocking out the sections of the site. And by the way, this also follows the next rule that we use, which is all divs get IDs or classes. So as you're putting in all these divs, they all get an ID or a class, no exceptions. And the rule of thumb is whether it's an ID or a class is, if it's unique, if this is only appears once on the page, it gets an ID. If it could possibly appear more than once, like an article or a section you see here, then it gets a class. So we'll go over, you know, that again. I'll do it as I'm doing it, but things that appear once, like header, navigation, footer, sidebar, you might have two sidebars, so that would have to be a class, but in this case we only have one. Those are IDs, and then everything else that could appear more than once on the page, like you can have more than one article, more than one section, those get classes. So all these divs have to get a ID or a class. The next one we have now is side nav, so we're going to do side nav and content and sidebar. Now you might think of those as one sort of also big area, and so that's a case where you could, I didn't write it out here, put a wrapper around it. And that's very common. So we might have something like this, div ID equals wrapper, that's going to cover all of those three elements, side nav, content, and sidebar. And another little trick that I use that you may or may not decide to use is I put comments in to show where my divs end, because what happens is as we start adding more and more stuff in here, it's hard to know, well, what div was this that ended that there. So you can actually use these now and then know what it is a little bit. Alright, so I'm going to copy my nav div here, and I'm going to put it in 3 times for side nav, content, and sidebar. And then just give them those names. Side nav, content, and sidebar. Okay, and as well with these, you could give the ending comments if you want to give a comment. This is how you give a comment. It opens with this and closes with that. I'm going to move on to the next piece, which is the footer. So as you can see, this is not super hard. You're basically just following along the plan that you worked out in your design. So now I have a foundation here for my HTML that I can place all the other content inside of. And the next step would be to go now and do a few other things. So my last rule is that the navigation is a list. So here my navigation is home, about me, portfolio, archive, contact. And I'm going to go put that in under the navigation here. Oops, I closed out that wrong. Getting ahead of myself. That's HTML5. They do have a nav element, but we don't have that in HTML4 or XHTML. So we can put in a list and then put our items in there, which I'm going to pause for a second while I put them in. So here we go. Now this is the navigation with a list inside of it. And the next step is to basically go in and add in some content for the rest of it that's there. So just to take one piece, I'll look at the actual content here, and let's say I have my blog post, and I also know some of these things like H3 and paragraph and so forth. I can start adding that in. So I know this is going to be a blog post, each one of these in there. So I can go into my content now. Let's go into content. Oh, and I apologize, I copied that incorrect div a few times, so I have to correct that here. I was getting ahead of myself. And so now we're going to put in a div, and we'll do it properly this time. We'll put in a couple for blog post. Except this now is going to be a class, because it was repeated, and that's blog post. So the other thing that you should start to notice about divs is that anytime you want to group together a few elements, you're basically going to use a div to group together elements. Right? And so in that, I'm going to use now my H3 and the paragraph. Oh, actually, there's another one down here we didn't look at. In addition to the H3, we have this the date down there. And so I'm going to say that's a paragraph, but I'll give it a special class of post info. There, so this is going to get post info. And basically the way, you don't have to add all these classes now. This is something you can do later. The more you get used to it, the more you're able to do it earlier. And it's just a way of identifying something that looks different than something else. So everything that's similar should get the same tags or classes. So we have H3, right? And we're going to get this title, so lorem ipsum, so that's our title, and then we have the description, I call it post info, and I could go in and actually copy that text. This is another thing that works well. If you let's see, entries here. Let's go to these and unlock them. So then we could actually come in and select that thing, copy it, and paste it in to there. So you won't always be able to do that, and you won't always want to do that, but sometimes it may or may not help you. And then, here I'm going to take this text here, and that's a paragraph, and add that in. Alright, and so now I'm starting to get my rhythm out here. Oh, we have another paragraph, just, to show in. So we're starting to see now how this is going to work out in terms of content. Alright, and then just one second here, and I'm going to open it up in a browser. So here it is in a browser. Right now it's not looking like a whole lot because all we put in so far was the navigation and which isn't styled, and then this one post here. One thing that you can do is to go in and add some minor CSS to add some background colors and borders around things if you want to be able to see the different sections that you're doing a little bit easier. But basically, we would just keep working with this. We would go through, and this is our other blog post. Probably at this point, since I'm being a little lazy and it's just a dummy text anyway, I would here, this is going to help me remember that this is the blog post end. There, oops, I didn't copy the whole thing properly. And I'll just copy that blog post and put another one in just so that's sort of fills it in. And keep going on with all the rest of not all of the content in terms of images and things like that, but in terms of the text, the elements that are going to be there. Go through and add that to my HTML file, and I could keep going back and looking at how it looks and going to my Photoshop document and adding more. So this here, we have some navigation on the side. I have another H2 element and stuff in my categories thing on the side nav, so I can start going into my side navigation now and adding that in. Oops, sorry. And so that's basically the rest of the process to add things in.